Ignite your curiosity with Austin Next. We're watching Austin transform from a thriving ecosystem into a global superstar. With our host, Jason Crawford, we aspire to better comprehend the true nature of innovation. Together, we will uncover what makes a successful ecosystem and navigate the technologies shaping our future. Now let's dive into what's next.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Austin Private Wealth, a registered investment advisor focused on fee-only financial planning and investment management. Their mission is to serve affluent clients with personalized financial advice, fostering a trusted relationship that will endure for generations to come. Austin Private Wealth is not just about managing wealth. They're about inspiring you to embrace a future filled with possibilities and helping you architect enduring legacies. Their core values of integrity, service, caring, excellence, and growth are at the heart of everything they do. Connect with them today at austinprivatewealth.com.
Austin Private Wealth is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Austin Private Wealth and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. No advice may be rendered by Austin Private Wealth unless a client service agreement is in place. Investing involves risk and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed professional.
For Austin to solidify its role as the next great innovation powerhouse, let's talk about what has come before and what are the trends pushing us forward. One area of study that greatly affects our future is trying to understand the very nature of progress itself. What is it? What drives it? And how does it affect our region's future? Today, we talk with Jason Crawford, founder and CEO of The Roots of Progress, a nonprofit dedicated to establishing a new philosophy of progress in the 21st century. Jason writes and speaks about the history and philosophy of progress, especially in technology and industry. Prior to Roots of Progress, he was a software engineering manager and tech startup founder. He was the co-founder and CEO of Fieldbook, a hybrid spreadsheet database. He was also an engineering manager at Flexport, Amazon, Groupon, and helped build a biotech supercomputer for D.E. Shaw Research. In addition to his essays and talks, he's writing a book titled The Story of Industrial Civilization.
Jason Crawford, welcome to the Austin Next podcast.
Thanks for having me here.
I wanted to start off with a couple of basic questions to kind of set the stage. Tell me what your philosophy of progress is. It's a term I've never seen before.
Yeah. I came up with that term, I may not have been the first to come up with it, but I started using it recently in the same sense that you might think about philosophy of science, philosophy of law. Various areas like this have some kind of foundational questions that border on philosophy or perhaps overlap with it. In the context of studying progress, both sort of general, progress in human well-being and maybe a bit more narrowly, material progress in science, technology, and industry. I think, the foundational questions are roughly, what is progress? How do we define and measure it? Is progress good? Or more broadly, kind of what are the pros, cons, risks, and trade-offs? So the value of progress. 3, what are the causes of progress? And ultimately, hopefully we can find the root causes, or, as I've said, the roots of progress. And a particularly important sub-question there is how much of those causes are within our control? Do we have agency and can we shape our future, our destiny? And then finally, coming out of all of that is maybe the 4th topic, which is what should society do about progress, right? So what should be our stance towards it, our relationship to it, and kind of how should we handle it? So I see those as kind of the broad questions that make up the philosophy of progress as such. And I think that every era that thinks about progress has some implicit or explicit answers to those questions. In the late 19th century, especially, and into the very early 20th century, people tended to answer some of those questions with fairly optimistic and positive answers, maybe even a little bit naively optimistic. In the 20th century, I think we saw a major attitude shift, certainly in the mid to late 20th century. I think it was a process that began around the end of the World Wars, if not before, and was certainly fairly well ensconced by, say, 1970 or so. There was a real souring on the concept of progress, and people started viewing it with much more, especially technological and industrial progress, with much more fear and distrust and skepticism. And I think that has not brought us to a great place in the 21st century, and certainly is not a good basis for going forward. So I think we need to regroup, look at this picture again, and not go back to maybe some of the naive views of the 19th century, but also try to come up with a new philosophy of progress for the 21st century that recognizes kind of the value and the great value to human life of technology and industry, and really reasserts our agency over the future, so that we can start to build a technologically ambitious future that we want to live in.
I want to talk about that and really dive into one thing. You talk about the great stagnation, and a lot of that seems to be post the Apollo moon landing, 69 and 70 kind of thing. So we're talking about now almost 50 years. What's the great stagnation, and how is it affecting us?
Yeah. So when folks who talk about progress talk about stagnation, they are talking about this sort of phenomenon over the last 50 years or so. Yeah. So you mentioned Apollo moon landing is 69, or, right, if you just want to pick a round number, you can call it 1970, where we have seen, I believe, a relative slowdown, not a complete halt, but a slowdown in technological and industrial progress not relative to the pre-industrial era, when things moved, very slowly before the Industrial Revolution, but certainly relative to, say, about 100 years ago. And I started out somewhat skeptical of this idea, especially because there has been so much progress when you look at the last 50 years. Most of the computer revolution, the entire internet revolution, all of that has happened since 1970. We've had genetic engineering, techniques and other things, and it just seems like life has continued to get a lot better. But then I started coming around to it when I started reading about what happened in even earlier periods, and how many amazing breakthroughs were stacked up in a very short period of time. So if you take the 50-year period starting about 100 years prior, so say starting in 1870 to 1920, in that period you had the entire electrical industry, including light bulbs, generators, and motors, and building out of the grid. 2, the internal combustion engine and the vehicles based on it, the automobile and the airplane. 3, the telephone and the radio, which together revolutionized communications. 4, applications of chemistry to give us things like synthetic fertilizer with the Haber-Bosch process, the first synthetic plastics with Bakelite, and then 5, a revolution in public health based on the new germ theory that was developed during that time, which gave us things like pasteurized milk, water chlorination, and better filtration, and so forth, and began to really reduce the mortality from infectious disease. So 5 major revolutions stacked up in that 50-year period that really covered pretty much every aspect of life and the economy. And I just don't think if you start to count up, how many similarly major breakthroughs were there in the last 50 years, I just don't think you get as many. I think you get 1 or 2 that I've already named. So I do think we've seen a relative slowdown, although again, progress still moving faster than at any time before the Industrial Revolution.
What happened? What changed?
Yeah. I have 3 hypotheses, which are not mutually exclusive. They all build on each other. So one is increasing sort of layers of bureaucracy and regulation. A lot of this is government and federal regulation, but not all of it. I think some of it is kind of self-regulation within both for-profit and non-profit private organizations. Hypothesis number 2 is the way that we fund and organize and manage research and development, especially scientific research, which got consolidated after the world wars into a small number of large federal agencies, which creates a bit of a monoculture for research funding, which is just generally, anytime you have a single method for funding things, for funding ambitious new projects that tend to challenge the status quo, you're going to have some blind spots. And so I think a greater diversity and sort of heterogeneity of such methods is, would maybe be better. And we've kind of done the opposite. Hypothesis 3, it relates to the philosophy of progress that I was just talking about. The fact that the culture has soured so much on the idea of progress, and, that young people, for instance, may not see engineering and business as such exciting and meaningful fields to go into anymore, and indeed a lot of young people have been instead attracted into sort of the opposite, trying to slow down and push back and fight, scientific and or especially technological and industrial progress, wherever it occurs. So those are kind of my three hypotheses.
How do we fix it?
There are a lot of things to do at a lot of different levels. I've been focusing on the most fundamental level, which is also the most long-term, which is that third hypothesis about our general attitudes towards progress. I think the basic way to get to a more accurate and healthier relationship to progress is to start by rediscovering the history. I think too many people today don't know the history of progress. They are not, really clearly aware, acutely aware of just how much life has been improved in the last couple of hundred years, how terrible living conditions were in many ways, even 100 years ago, let alone 200 years ago. And so I think a lot of people tend to take the modern world for granted. It's easy even for us maybe who appreciate it on some level to just forget on a day-to-day basis that, everything from the concrete foundations under our feet to the steel girders around us and the plate glass windows to the electric lights overhead, all of this is really a gift from our ancestors and something I think we should look on with a little bit of awe and wonder and gratitude for those scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs of the past who fought to bring these things into reality. And I think most people don't have that perspective. So part of what I'm trying to do with my work is to just tell the story again. I think the story of progress has never really adequately been told certainly not for a general audience in a way that's accessible outside of maybe, the academic halls of economic history and so forth. And so I think starting with that, just sort of retelling the story and communicating the basic facts of what life used to be like and the amazing discoveries and inventions that gave us the modern world, I think that's the place to start on that very basic level. In terms of some more short-term and more directed areas, there are a number of folks who are working on new ways of funding scientific research. And I'll rattle off just a few, but I'm going to be dropping a bunch. My friend Ben Reinhardt is working on an effort that he calls Private ARPA. There is another idea out there called Focused Research Organizations. There's a new nonprofit that started up last year, I believe, called New Science. And these are just a few efforts there. You can see there's been a couple of recent articles on some of these efforts going on and what they're doing. So I think that is really exciting. I'll also call out something that just launched a few days ago last week, which was called the Institute for Progress. It's a new Washington, D.C. policy think tank advocating what can be done in D.C. in government to help unblock and accelerate progress. So there's a number of things going on at different levels, and I'm excited for this whole ecosystem of projects that's coming about as this community that has formed around progress starts to swing into action.
So I want to take us back into that kind of arc of history, and I think has been one of the most important connections with progress and innovation, and that's been geography. If we look at, it's been concentrated regions, right? So recently it was Silicon Valley, Detroit in, the 1950s, during the Industrial Revolution, it was London, and you go back to ancient times, right? It was Rome, Athens, Babylon. Why do you think we had such geographic concentrations throughout history of progress and innovation?
I mean, I think that, people want to go where the action is happening, right? So I think that there's lots of reasons why communication and communities, help people advance their ideas and take on ambitious projects. So there's both an effect where the smartest and most ambitious and talented people are attracted to and flock to centers where there are other such people and where exciting and ambitious projects are going on. And then also once they're there, they're just in this milieu where they're constantly talking to people about exciting new ideas. And so those things just sort of build on each other. It's definitely an effect where a beginning of a nucleus of that sort of thing will then build on itself and attract, talent attracts more talent. So I think it's not at all surprising that we've seen these things focus in particular areas, especially in the world before the internet, where if you wanted to have this communication, you had to, a lot of it actually was done face to face, and even today, still a significant amount of it still is.
Well, and it's interesting, right? As we kind of layer in, because even with the internet in place, prior to the pandemic, it was, no, geography really matters. You had like the 20-minute VC rule. And then at the height of, call it, late 2020, early 2021, it was this, no, geography doesn't matter. You don't need to, everyone can be everywhere, right? And now we're kind of, I think, getting to this, does geography matter? And so where, when you have remote work and collaboration, but you still have these kind of hubs attracting people, where are you landing on? Does geography matter kind of going forward?
Yeah, geography still matters. I think it matters noticeably less than it used to. And I do think the pandemic accelerated that. For context, before I went full-time on studying progress, my previous career was in the tech industry. My background's in computer science and software engineering. I've lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for over a decade and started a couple of tech startups while I was here. So my head is also sort of deeply in the Silicon Valley community, and there's certainly what pre-pandemic, or certainly 5 or 10 years ago, there was among many people, if not everyone, a sort of idea that, like, if you were doing a tech startup and you weren't in the San Francisco area or Silicon Valley area, then you just weren't really serious, or you weren't really committed, or you were making a mistake, right? Not everybody believed that, but I think it was a sizable, contingent of people who did believe that. And so Silicon Valley had this kind of monopoly on, it was just like the undisputed place to be. And so now post pandemic, I think it's still number one on anybody's list. Like, there isn't any other place that's now better. But its relative importance, I think, has been diminished to the point where nobody's going to think you're crazy if you're doing a startup somewhere else. Nobody's going to say, "You idiot, why aren't you in San Francisco?" Whereas they might have said that in the past. So yeah, COVID just forced everybody to run the experiment. Well, hey, what if we tried remote work? What if we tried doing an investment without meeting face to face, just doing it over Zoom? And I mean, I know tech companies that prior to the pandemic had a policy against remote work. They didn't want people to do it. And then as soon as the pandemic hit, they said, "Hey, everybody, we are going totally remote." And so everybody's just been forced to try it. And a lot of people found out, hey, you know what, it works fairly well. And when you combine that with a lot of people just very frustrated with San Francisco city governance and what's been happening to the city, then, living conditions deteriorating, housing prices continuing to be very, very high. And then you realize, what are we doing this for, right? And then, also with the pandemic, I think a lot of young people realized, well, hey, the reason I was living in the city and paying these very high rents was to, go out to restaurants, get together with my friends, date, et cetera. And now all of a sudden I can't do any of those things. So why am I here paying this? I might as well just, get a group house with my friends out in the country somewhere and pay a lot less for a lot more space and, have a better time. So that was another experiment that we were, essentially forced to run. So.
And think about funding, right? You said all these new funding mechanisms are starting to come up and people trying out different models. And one assumes as you said previously, that kind of that centralization of funding also leading towards incumbency, right? Whether they were large companies, major universities. Are we seeing, and obviously some of these new, you said, the Institute of Progress was announced only like last week, but do you see some of these also funding mechanisms creating regional diversity as well? Like, it's not just the major tech centers, but it's these different places and different kinds of people who are starting to get the fast grants. I can see lots of these different new things kind of coming up.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a difference between tech for-profit investment versus, some of the nonprofit grants and science research and so forth. I mean, science research has always been a little more distributed because it's been mostly done in universities, and the universities themselves are more distributed than than say the tech industry or other industries that show high concentration like Hollywood, right?
We still have, I think, the brand, I mean, MIT, Caltech, the major brand institutions, even within the universities, as much as they're distributed, are still absorbing a significant amount of the funding. So I'm just curious, as you see more individual researchers or new ideas kind of getting an opportunity that weren't necessarily open when, you couldn't go apply to NIH if you were a single person trying to do some sort of interesting experiment, right?
Yeah, so some of the early experiments that we've seen in science funding have stayed within the model of universities as the home for research, and they've just tried to improve the way that those researchers get the funds. So one of the first that we actually saw launched was Fast Grants, which was launched specifically for COVID. It was launched in like April of 2020, so very soon after the pandemic became a big thing. And its goal specifically was just to get money to researchers faster than the traditional processes were going to do it. And I think, in part to do that, they said, we're going to stick with some of the traditional, we're going to be giving grants to principal investigators. That's a term in academia, principal investigators within, sort of established research labs at established universities and so forth, right? So they were wisely not attempting to change that part of the way the system works. I do think that over time, we will see more, we will eventually maybe see people challenging the idea that the research needs to happen in the university. There's a lot of good you can do, even just within the universities, in terms of who gets the funding. Is it going towards younger people or all towards these older, later career folks? What about grad students? Can they get funding for projects, or do they have to wait until they become a professor? How much overhead is there to the funding? Do PIs, the principal investigators, have to spend 30 to 50% of their time on fundraising, which seems like a waste? Or can we get the overhead down to 10 to 15%, right? And how much freedom do we give them? So once you get a grant, do you have to get a grant for like a very specific thing, and then you can only use the grant for that thing, no matter what you may learn, as you go through the course of your research? Or can we give you a lot more scientific freedom to just pursue a vision, even if it's not one that you can very clearly articulate or justify up front, but we're just going to trust your hunch and your intuition about what's a good path to pursue? So those are a bunch of sort of things that you can change within the current system without leaving the university as the home. However, there are some arguments, I think, to say, hey, maybe we actually need to also create a significant non-university, place for researchers. For one reason is just like the universities actually take they take a big chunk out of every grant. So they need, the university sort of takes a piece for their overhead, and some of that obviously they're providing the facilities, and like it makes sense, but they can take up to half of it, in some cases, and it seems a little excessive, right? So we might be able to get more efficiencies by avoiding that kind of thing. I should be clear, they don't take half of every grant, and a lot of nonprofits, when they're giving money, they manage to negotiate it down to like 10% or something. But like in some cases, they are taking large chunks. But then, like most broadly, I think some people have criticized just the career path that researchers have to go through, where they're going down this path where they need to optimize certain metrics like citations and publications and so forth. It's something called the H index, which is related to the citations. And and it can lead you to maybe structure your work in certain ways that are suboptimal, or focus on certain things that are suboptimal. And you get to a point where you say, hey, we actually want to change the incentives. Like the incentive structure is causing people to not go for big, ambitious things that could create huge breakthroughs. It's actually causing them to be maybe more incremental or short term. How do we change the incentive structure? Well, that's very difficult, because to offer people different incentives, you're basically asking them to step off of a career path that they were thinking that they would be on for the rest of their life and step onto maybe a different one. And so now they have to ask a really tough question of themselves, which is, am I willing to go down, am I willing to optimize for different incentives, knowing that I am not setting myself up to optimize for my long-term scientific career under traditional incentives, right? And that is a much more difficult long-term thing, but I think it's doable if it's, if it's really valuable.
I think it's also difficult because you have the kind of well-worn path of the researcher, and then of course the researchers that step out into the for-profit startup world. But this is kind of that third tier, right? It's something kind of a little bit different in the researcher, but you may have to have certain level of risk tolerance that you're not going to have to go out and say, hey, I'm going to go not only start this new path, but then do a path that hasn't been well established yet and figured out. And so that you kind of have that self-selection of people who are staying in the academia are slightly more risk averse. Otherwise, they'll be the ones who are probably jumping out and starting companies. So it's an interesting kind of chicken and the egg scenario.
Yeah. I mean, so one way you can approach this is you can take an evaporative strategy, by which I mean, the first researchers that you recruit into this, into this new model are the people who are already maybe a little fed up with the traditional structures, not happy with kind of the way they need to optimize their career, ready to ditch it all anyway. And, maybe they're ready to just go like join a startup or something and leave academia and not become a researcher. And you tell them, hey, before you do that, I've got this alternate path. If you're ready to leave that career path anyway, here's a way that you can continue to pursue your research, right? And so you get a couple of mavericks who are fed up with the system and just willing to do that. Then, but you make sure that they're really great, extremely intelligent, talented people, and they do great work. Okay, so over time, they do good work, and now they've added just a little bit of credibility to the system, right, to this alternate path. And then the next person you recruit doesn't need to be 100% ready to leave the system. They can be 97% ready to leave the system because you've gotten just a little bit more credibility for your alternate path, right? And then they come and they add a little more credibility, and then the next person only needs to be 95% ready, right? And so you can sort of work your way through the marginal researchers, recruiting more and more to this path. And your alternate path kind of gets more and more credible and established, and eventually it becomes mainstream. And it's just, hey, there are these different paths where there's this university path, there's this alternate path where we don't optimize for citations and so forth, and choose your path.
No, it is interesting in terms of institution building, new paths, new models. I think that's a lot of the innovation that's kind of occurring right now, not just straight product or solution or different types of innovation. One of the things I want to get to, as we're seeing this different types of innovation, you have an essay called The Dashboards of Progress, which I found was one of the first ones I actually read when kind of coming across your work, which I found really interesting when you talked about how is GDP not necessarily the best measure of progress, right? And when we look at progress, right, we tend to think about either input metrics like how many jobs, how many STEM degrees, patents, et cetera, or the pure outcome metrics of like GDP, et cetera, which are, again, they're all fine. They're good metrics, but I could be having lots of STEM degrees that are not necessarily resulting in progress. I could also have amazing GDP growth that may be more due to scale, transition, demographics than necessarily progress and innovation. So how do you kind of think about that, when we want this new philosophy of progress, as we think about innovation going forward, what are the kinds of metrics that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, the question of measuring progress is really tough, especially if you want to try to measure it. Really measure it quantitatively. GDP is the thing that almost everybody almost always falls back on because it's just sort of the most, natural metric. It's a thing that's measured, and so it's easy to get. It's measured worldwide. It's been measured over time. There's like lots of data to work with there. The challenge of look, anytime you always have this context in almost any context when you're trying to measure something, right? You're taking some proxy metric that is not literally the thing you care about. And you always have this challenge, whether you're a researcher, whether you're a manager in a corporation or a nonprofit, whether you're, as an individual, anybody, you try to measure things and you're almost always measuring a proxy, right? Unless you're a physicist, maybe. So the thing about progress is like we sort of want to measure some general concept of like human well-being, right? Like kind of how happy and fulfilled are people, right? Like a thriving and flourishing index. And it's not a thing that we can measure with any sort of, who knows? Maybe someday we'll be able to measure it quantitatively. Maybe that will require, a direct probe into everybody's neurons or something, and we can measure the fulfillment center of the brain. I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but we certainly don't have that today. So what do we measure? Okay, we measure things like GDP. GDP has all sorts of problems when it comes to this, right? In particular, GDP measures spending. So it measures spending on consumer goods, basically, and that means when things get cheaper, if people don't buy more of them, GDP goes down, right? But actually, things getting cheaper is good because now people are getting the same value for less money, right? When Google gives away internet search for free and creates an enormous amount of consumer surplus, right? The consumer surplus is not reflected in GDP. Conversely, when governments go to war, spending on military gets, is part of GDP, right? Even though that spending is now being used for destruction. So there's all these different ways in which it doesn't exactly match up to what we want. One way to approach this is to say, I think the most sound way to approach this is to say, no one metric no one thing that we can look at is going to tell us exactly what we want about human well-being. If we want to get a handle on that, we need to look at lots of different metrics and try to add up and integrate conceptually an overall picture, right? So when we want to look at progress, we don't just look at GDP. We look at things like mortality and life expectancy, right? We look at the incidence of disease and disasters like, car crashes or fires. We look at the total, the penetration of certain types of key inventions that enhance well-being, right? So how many people can afford a car? How many people have a washing machine? How many people have electricity or toilets and running water and a refrigerator in their home and so forth, right? How many teenagers complete high school? How many people are literate? So you look at all these different metrics, and the good thing epistemically, the good news is a lot of these things all tend to go together, right? And so this is one of the things that reinforces, hey, why should we look at GDP anyway? Well, it turns out GDP is correlated with a whole lot of other things that are more obviously like metrics of human well-being, including things like life expectancy and, access to electricity and running water and literacy rates and, all these different things, right? So that's another reason why we can sort of come back to it as our, if we have to pick one metric, it's as good as any to pick.
It's interesting. Obviously, this podcast, and we're very focused on, the Austin region, and these metrics we've talked about tend to be better indicators the larger you get, right? Like world GDP, country level, you can look at mortality, all these things. But what's interesting is when trying to understand it at a regional city metro level, right, an ecosystem level, it becomes difficult because if you're truly innovative and you've truly created progress, that is being exported outside, right? We may have high life expectancy in the city of Austin, and if we invent some sort of life-saving drug, the better use case may be happening elsewhere, right? So you can't direct that direct measure, right? And so you back to these kind of input measures again in terms of just like, well, we have lots of people working on things. Any thoughts on how we can think about some of these large scale metrics, but then bringing them down and just thinking about the level of innovationness or that we get at a ecosystem level?
In part, it depends on whether it's for-profit or non-profit, right? So with for-profit ventures, you have a metric over the long term, which is their profitability and perhaps their valuation or market cap or their revenue, or, you have sort of key things like that to look at, which are, your revenue is presumably a lower bound on the value that you're creating. You're right. Because the full value is is the consumer surplus, right? Your profit is sort of a lower bound on like the net value you're creating, right? So even companies that end up creating a whole ton of consumer surplus, like Google, for instance, are going to, I think, end up finding some way to capture, some portion of that and become massively profitable. If you're looking at nonprofits, it's much harder. And the whole, even trying to objectively measure and compare nonprofits and how much good they do is like a relatively recent thing that efforts like GiveWell and, the rest of the effective altruist movement have sort of focused on. But I think you would have to, pick some metric like, they look at whatever quality adjusted life years saved or added to the world. And like, maybe you'd have to look at something like that and then attribute it to cities.
Well, let's dive into one of those cities, the one that we're always talking about, and that is Austin. Where do you see Austin fitting into this long arc of progress?
You all probably have a better answer about that than I do. But all I will say is that a lot of my friends and favorite people and some of the smartest and most ambitious folks I know have moved to Austin in the last year or two. And so I'm actually quite jealous. And if there were a single place that I were to go actually to just like hang out with people and have great conversations and get inspired to go do great things, it would be Austin right now. That's my personal circle. But it's unfortunately, they used to be San Francisco for me personally. And due to some combination of people leaving San Francisco and my, personal interests shifting from tech startups to this broader world of progress studies, that balance has shifted for me right now. So the other thing about metrics is that there are both leading and lagging indicators, right? And some of the most direct ways of measuring what you want to measure turn out to be very lagging indicators. And if you want to know whether you're on track for the future, you have to look for leading indicators. And so I would say, density of great people is a leading indicator that probably leads by a decade or two, these really great outcomes. By that measure, I think Austin's doing pretty well, at least from my very subjective, viewpoint.
I want to understand a little bit more eventually about how we measure the density of great people, whether it's Austin or elsewhere. Let's flip the coin on that. What are the challenges that we're facing here in Texas as well as in the United States?
I mean, a big challenge that the United States is facing just broadly is how difficult it is to build anything. And I can mean this both literally and metaphorically, but just literally, it's difficult to build housing in many major cities. It's difficult to build infrastructure almost anywhere. There's been a number of different articles and sort of stories on this. It's almost impossible to build nuclear power plants, as one example. It's difficult to build even, much more popular things like transit or, rail. And all of these things, we have some of the highest costs in the world and the longest delays to build. And I think that is... Unfortunately, it's not something that's being that I think is really on the radar of a lot of people or is getting addressed at sort of the highest policy levels. We got this whole policy proposal or this whole proposal in Congress to build back better. We got this infrastructure bill, and it's all just pouring money into the same bucket that a lot of it seems to leak out of and not deliver a lot. Right? There's not much not much of that proposal was, if anything of it was, a proposal for how do we figure out how to build more efficiently and effectively and make better use of our resources. So I think unfortunately we're just sort of pouring a lot of resources into into these systems and processes that have already shown themselves to be not very efficient. That's one major problem facing the country. Absolutely.
Our final question is always the same question. Jason Crawford, what's next, Austin?
What's next, Austin? Well, let's see. I'm going to be there in March for an event that is to be announced soon. So if anybody is listening to this and would like to meet me, please reach out. And I hope that I will be coming back a couple times a year at least to meet the great community that is there. Beyond that, again, you all would probably have a better view of it than I do, but I do hope that with all the great folks who are moving there, that there is a chance for a great new community or an improved community of smart, talented, ambitious people looking to do great things. And so you never know what's going to come out of that, but that's where great things come from.
Jason Crawford, Roots of Progress. Thank you for joining us on the Austin Next podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.